Welcome to Mr. Tagatron Films. Today I got a Resident Evil video for you since the franchise reaches its big 30th anniversary this year. We got Requiem coming out, and I'd imagine some other projects, maybe some surprises. Nonetheless, today I want to talk about Resident Evil. I haven't talked about it in a while on this channel, but I've talked about previous topics like how the rocket launcher is Resident Evil's coolest trope, or how the hunters are really terrifying enemy because of how cheap they can be, or why we really need a Resident Evil toy line, and another video why I love Resident Evil 6. But with all that in mind, right? Resident Evil's big anniversary, I want to talk about the real purpose of this franchise, the methods behind it, and how we live in a world where the internet and pop culture are assimilated into each other because the internet dictates a lot of what is seen, what is promoted, and whatnot, what discourse you have online. I remember the days of message boards, and these days it's all just Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Reddit, and what have you. Times change, that's fine, but I want to talk about a different kind of discourse, and that's Resident Evil, right? YouTube's a big platform. You see similar topics, like every month there's some Resident Evil 7 video talking about how it changed their franchise, or a video and some other half of the YouTube talking about, Resident Evil 4 and remake, or what have you, right? Just examples thrown out there, throwing a bone. But I want to talk about what I think, as a fan, a guy who's really got into this franchise, what I personally adore about it. That would be its versatility with horror. And that brings us to the main topic, that horror is versatile. And a metric for judging Resident Evil shouldn't just be that, a game is scary, or a game has, more blood than a different one, or the horror is right in your face, right? Or something else like, action sucks unless we say it's okay, meaning it's just, Resident Evil 4 apparently is the only one that can be action, when in reality Resident Evil's always been about action, because if you look at horror movies, especially horror movies that most likely inspired Resident Evil, the original game, well, horror almost always ends in action. That's the truth. Horror almost always ends in action by the time we reach the most exciting part of the story, that being the climax or what have you. You can have Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness. You can have Predator and Predator 2, and so on and so forth. When it comes to Resident Evil as a franchise, again, horror is very important, but for me, the most fascinating part is how the US government and other countries, dark governments, societies, black markets, what have you, have all chipped in on bioweapons, and the result of Umbrella and Umbrella's downfall leading to a whole slew of a real Pandora's box and bioweapons and bioterror. Like, come on, if there's one Resident Evil project we should have gotten a decade ago, it would be like Law and Order meets Resident Evil, following different BSA factions battling small bioterror, events. Stuff like that would be, for me, more enriching as a fan. But nonetheless, Resident Evil should be versatile. It's not just horror, it's not just action, it's both and more. I think the real interesting thing is that, sure, the franchise may have gotten stuck following the same set of characters at this point in the big year of 2026. However, I would say that Resident Evil can still branch out, right? My past video about the toy line is just an idea. By making a toy line about the different bioweapons from each game could be a real way to celebrate the whole franchise. Look at the Revelations games. People hardly talk about those, and a lot of the modern framework of Resident Evil comes from Revelations 2 and even 1, and those are little gems I love. And my big thing is that Resident Evil, again, is so many things, right? Like, look at the first Revelations game. It has a freaking artificial city, a modern Atlantis sitting on top of the ocean, and then it gets taken out by a fucking solar laser satellite beam. Like, what? You know what I mean? And they use that beam to take out the freaking hunters. Stuff like that, I think, is, it may be asinine, but I think the craziness of Resident Evil is where it brings me back to it, right? A good chuckle fuck of a time. Like, look at all the 80s movies that you might love that, balance goofiness, like Predator 1, Predator 2, RoboCop, things that have comedy, but it's more coming from the lens of how our world is always conflicting, right? People are layered. People have layers to them. And, a lot of people these days, especially with gaming, they get really pretentious and wanting characters to have, multi-layered arcs for some kind of pretentious, Oscar wannabe style or what have you. For me, when it comes to characters, I just like them to be entertaining. When it comes to Resident Evil, even a character like, say Steve, I really come around on. And Code Veronica, a character, supposedly is annoying, and I can see why he can be, but I really came around to the guy. Think of other one-off characters that are pretty legendary, like the guy who's the legend himself, Joss Stone, played by the wonderful T.G. Storm. Awesome other characters like Parker from Revelations 1. And of course, my main man, Barry Burton, who had a really nice spotlight in Revelations 2. I already loved Barry before then, but Revelations 2 really solidified why I like that character. Things like that can show why we love these characters, right? And then you have the main badasses like Chris, Jill, Leon, Ada, and villains that I remember like Wesker, and really interesting ones like Alexia, Norman from Revelations 1. Then you have Alex Wesker, and Simmons, and Carla, and Sadler, and, well, of course, Nemesis. So many other memorable villains that really make this franchise stand out, and why these bioweapons and are very rooted in, scientifically body horror, but they all draw different inspirations while having something to say, right? Even looking at the Wii games like the Umbrella Chronicles and Darkside Chronicles, there's some interesting, unique villains that just pop up there that help flesh out this world. And even checking out weird, random games that I, haven't been able to get my hands on, like the Outbreak games or Dead Aim or many others. There's so many interesting facets of Resident Evil that just isn't really branched out anymore, right? I know they tried doing things like some online games, but come on, right? If you're gonna do online Resident Evil, take a note from Resident Evil 6, and take a note from just Mercenaries as a whole from throughout the whole franchise, right? Like, we got to a point where Mercenaries, for its new fans, started with the remake of 4 instead of the remake of 3, right? Like, Mercenaries, come on, it originated in the original Resident Evil 3. Small things like that have been lost to time, sadly. But thankfully, the original Resident Evil 2 and 3 are out on most online stores now. Thankfully, that's one good thing Capcom's done in terms of preservation. Just talking about preservation. Now, when it comes to Resident Evil, again, it's not just action, it's not just horror, it's not just seriousness, it's not just goofiness, it's all the above. And when you have really talented writers that can blend everything, and again, these are supposed to be video games, and if I want a more serious horror movie, I'll go find that. When it comes to Resident Evil, I want a video game experience with more nuance and subtle details if you explore the environment, or just take in the mannerisms of characters, right? You don't need a big soliloquy from everybody about what they're feeling, you just need to kind of see it as it goes and kind of make some inferences. And when it comes to animated films, I think Death Island and Infinite Darkness were real letdowns. But Vendetta, Damnation, and Degeneration are good stuff, right? Little side stories that you can just take in as you go. And it's nice to see returning characters. But things like that, right? Even those original 3 anime films help highlight like themes of warfare and American imperialism, and things that relate to the games themselves, right? Bioweapons, corruption, how all the governments in the world could be, putting their hand in bioweapons beneath the curtain that people never know about. And that's what makes Resident Evil interesting, right? Resident Evil is like if you smashed your G.I. Joe figures with like a George Romero zombie movie, and I went to the mall where they filmed Dawn of the Dead and the cemetery for Night of the Living Dead, with, seeing the George Romero statue of some very good friends of mine. Like, I really have a deep appreciation for horror and where horror can originate from, even further back looking at macro-based stories of, centuries old legends, what have you, right? Even history itself is horror of warfare and colonization and whatever other horrible greed humanity has done. But themes like that escalate and evolve across time with people making art to reflect the times. That's the key here. I do think that Resident Evil, right, coming at the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, is another piece of pop culture, especially with the internet letting you, browse Resident Evil more than ever. You just have to go look and find the history for yourself. I think that with the turn of the century, Resident Evil has become a unique sort of time capsule for not just, horror tropes and trends, but action and thrills and suspense, Like Resident Evil 4, I always thought the original was like a spy, James Bond-ish kind of feel to it, with a little bit of Rambo in there, First Blood. And Resident Evil 5 is more like, Black Hawk Down and more of darker, bleak warfare. Resident Evil 6 is like a big celebration of all things Resident Evil with different themes. And like every boss and major enemy in that game is a reflection of previous enemies in the franchise. And I think that's a really great achievement. Resident Evil 6 is incorporating past homages and themes to previous bosses, bioweapons, and villains, but not making it in your face. You know what I mean? Just one example, if you haven't seen my Resident Evil 6 video, there's you fight a snake and a shark in that game, and there's even a character that's supposed to be emblematic of Alexia Ashford, and then you have Simmons, who transforms a lot like Birkin, and another thing is that it's like older Resident Evil games are able to have transformations for their bosses right in the game, whether that be a cutscene or even in the engine itself. A lot of newer games can't even do that for some reason. It's not just Resident Evil, it's not just modern Resident Evil. A lot of other game engines just can't do the stuff from an artistic standpoint that older games could. Nonetheless, like I said, I think Resident Evil as a franchise is a time capsule of pop culture in different ways, right? The video game industry, and drawing inspiration from horror and showing how both games and pop culture entertainment have evolved over time with the growth of the internet, and just seeing where people have come to appreciate art. And if I could tie all that together into this video, I'm very happy that Resident Evil has reached its 30th anniversary. That's very well earned. I just hope Capcom sees the gold mine they have in front of them, and instead of trying to retread the past too much or make a new game that just really doesn't feel like it's truly, pushing the series forward, instead take notes, Capcom, and just look at what you have in front of you, this golden goose, and just take what you have, take the good parts of remembering the past, and branch out and really make Resident Evil something that's very special, right? Because again, this is a franchise that kind of Alien vs. Predator or RoboCop or even Terminator, could do a lot more with it. You could evolve it and take something that was inherently original and find the originality that does exist with it, and keeping in mind the inspirations that created Resident Evil in the first place. All that in mind, you can really do something special with it and do something more. Like I said, I would love to see a Law and Order style show about the BSAA, one of their branches, battling small bioweapon threats, and you can even have guest characters pop up like Sheva, Josh, Parker from Revelations, or anybody else. Do something like that. Or even have a project about just random bioweapon threats that have popped up with new characters that do take place with the continuity of the games, and just showing what's out there in Resident Evil and how normal everyday people have to deal with these threats that have almost ended the world, right? Again, if you look at Resident Evil, if I could give you one parting, thought, it's not just about the zombies. The zombies are just a side effect, right? The whole point of the plot of these games is because this pharmaceutical company, Umbrella, and their, higher ups the US government were wanting to create weapons for warfare. And as you see from Resident Evil 1 to Resident Evil 6, you go from side effects and, disregarded bioweapons to, by the time of the 2010s, that bioweapons can now be shot out of missiles and wreak entire havoc. That, Raccoon City was just one milestone, but after that, other cities have been attacked throughout the course of Resident Evil. But then you get something like the Vendetta movie, where you can show the zombie outbreak being cured, right? And that's the thing about Resident Evil. It's ultimately, you go from, disregarded bioweapons to actual bioterror of weapons made for mass warfare, to having cures for these weapons and having hope at the end of the day. Because if there's one thing I love about Resident Evil, there's hope for surviving horror and doing things that even the most evil of minds could never have thought of, in terms of being a good person and fighting back against that evil and staying true to yourself. If there's one thing about Resident Evil, they do willpower, but they can also do it in ways that are about humanity, that they're still going to be lost of life, but There's also going to be the prevalence of the human spirit against all odds and finding happiness and forging a path so new generations can survive and thrive. That's how I describe Resident Evil. There's always going to be greed and conquest of people wanting to create weapons, and in this case, bioweapons, but there's also people that will fight to make sure there's a better tomorrow. That may not be an answer because in the world of Resident Evil, bioweapons are a never-ending threat. You know, those damn BOWs are everywhere. They're out there. However, good can still be never-ending. Good can keep up with evil to hopefully one day rid the world of bioweapons. Of course, in Resident Evil, they're going to keep making sequels. They're not going to end it, but my point still stands from an artistic standpoint of finding meaning. You can have some very powerful stories in Resident Evil. And I just hope Capcom quits limiting the potential of this franchise I adore. Thank you guys so much for watching. Every Mr. Tiger Films, let me know in the comments what your favorite Resident Evil memories are. And please like and share and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay tuned for more.